She was 9 years old. She had freckles on her nose, a baseball bat she carried like a trophy, and a pair of brand new lavender shoes she had unwrapped on Christmas morning and refused to take off. She was the loudest laugh in any room she entered, the kind of child who made strangers smile without trying. And on a cold January evening in 1972, she walked out the front door of her apartment, half a block from home, into a neighborhood she had known her entire life, and she never came back. Her name was Debbie Lynn Randall. Debbie to everyone who loved her. And for 51 years, the man who took her went to sleep every single night in a house, in a neighborhood, surrounded by people who had no idea what he had done. He lived, he aged, he died, and he almost took his secret to the grave forever. This is the story of how a 9-year-old girl, a pair of lavender shoes, and a piece of cloth no bigger than a coin finally broke a half-century of silence and brought a killer to justice from beyond the grave. If you're new to this channel, welcome to Stories Solved the Missing J. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and drop a comment below telling me how you found this story. The algorithm does not favor cases like this one. Every comment, every share, every subscriber keeps Debbie's name alive. Now, let's go back to 1972. To understand what happened to Debbie Randall, you have to understand the world she lived in. Marietta, Georgia in January of 1972 was not the kind of place where parents lay awake at night imagining the worst. It was a neighborhood where you knew the names of the families 3 doors down, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where nobody thought twice about leaving a door unlocked or letting a child walk to the corner alone. It was the kind of town that existed in that specific window of American life, just before the country lost its innocence about what could happen to a child in a familiar place. The Randall family fit right into that world. They were ordinary in the most beautiful sense of the word. A family held together by routine and love and the sound of kids running through the apartment. Debbie's older brother Melvin was 10, just 1 year ahead of her, in the way that only siblings with a single year between them can be. He was her best friend. They fought the way best friends fight, and they played the way best friends play, and on the baseball diamond behind their building, they were the most competitive people either of them knew. Debbie didn't just play baseball because Melvin did. She played it better than him. She wanted him to know it. He always pretended he didn't. That Thursday evening, though, Melvin was in bed with a fever. He was sick enough to stay home from everything, from dinner, from the television show that was on, from the laundry run their stepfather Frank was about to make to the Duds and Suds laundromat barely half a block from their front door. The laundry needed to go. Debbie was fine. She knew the way. She had been there before. Frank walked her over himself, loaded the clothes into 2 machines, got both cycles running, and handed Debbie a coin. The coin she would need to switch the loads when the first cycle finished. The machines needed another 40 minutes. Frank walked home. Half a block. A familiar neighborhood. A child who knew every face on that street. There was no reason in the world to worry. And that is exactly what makes what came next so devastating. Because the absence of danger is not the same as safety. And somewhere in the shadow of that parking lot, a man was already watching. Inside the laundromat, Debbie did what Debbie always did. She played. She stacked empty detergent boxes into towers and knocked them down. She talked with the women and girls who were folding clothes nearby, unbothered by the fact that she didn't know them, because Debbie was never bothered by strangers. She had the rare kind of warmth that made people feel like they had known her for years after 5 minutes. Time moved slowly the way it does when you're 9 years old, and the only thing you're waiting for is a washing machine. The women nearby watched her without watching her, the way adults do with children who seem completely fine. And for 40 minutes, everything was fine. Then at 7:15 in the evening, Debbie stood up. She said goodbye to the women inside. She pushed open the glass door. She stepped out into the cold night air. And that was the last ordinary moment of her life. A 12-year-old girl was standing outside the building when Debbie came through that door. She saw a man approach. She saw him grab Debbie. And here's the part that has lived inside this case like a splinter for over 50 years. The 12-year-old didn't scream. She didn't run, because in the split second her brain had to process what she was seeing, it gave her the most human explanation it could find. She assumed it was a father, grabbing a misbehaving daughter, pulling her toward the car. The assumption that comes from a world where that kind of thing still makes sense. But then the truck lurched forward. It didn't pull away slowly the way a frustrated parent would. It tore away from the curb with the desperation of a man who knows exactly what he has just done. The 12-year-old had to jump back to keep from being hit. As the truck accelerated down the street and the distance between her and it grew, she caught one final image in the rearview mirror. The driver was looking directly at her, not panicking, not rushed, not afraid, just looking, calculating, deciding in one cold, silent moment that she was not a problem. Then he was gone, and Debbie Lynn Randall was gone with him. By 7:30, Debbie had not come through the front door. Frank and Juanita told themselves it was fine. By 8 o'clock, Juanita's stomach had started to tell her something different. By 8:30, she couldn't stay in that apartment one more second. She walked to the laundromat. The employee she spoke to told her the little girl had left over an hour ago. Juanita's walk home became something else entirely after that. She moved through the parking lot across the street with the focused, terrible energy of a mother who has not yet accepted the thing her body already knows. And then she stopped. On the ground in front of her, a spilled box of laundry detergent, the contents scattered across the asphalt. And on the side of a Volkswagen Beetle parked at the edge of the lot, handprints, small ones, child-sized, smeared downward along the door panel, as if small hands had pressed against that car while the body they belonged to was being pulled away from it. A second witness would later come forward to confirm that they had seen a dark 1950s model pickup truck backed up to that exact location around 7 o'clock that evening and watched it accelerate away at a speed that didn't belong in a parking lot. The truck was long gone, but it had left a map of what happened, written in spilled detergent and small handprints, and the memory of a 12-year-old who hadn't understood what she was watching until it was too late. Back in the apartment, Melvin still didn't know. He was lying in bed with his fever, watching television, waiting for his sister to come home the way she always came home. He didn't know that the last time he had heard her voice, some casual exchange in the hallway before she left, the kind you don't think to memorize, was the last time he would ever hear it. He was 10 years old. He would carry that not knowing for 51 years. John Randall got the call at the Ford Motor Plant and left without a second's hesitation. Within the hour, the family was moving through the neighborhood in every direction, knocking on doors, calling her name, retracing every possible step Debbie might have taken between the laundromat and home. And Melvin got out of bed. Fever or no fever, his little sister was missing, and no amount of sickness was going to keep him horizontal while she was out there somewhere. He pulled on his shoes, went outside, and went door to door through the dark. A 10-year-old boy, still sick, still pushing, asking every neighbor the same question. Have you seen Debbie? Every single person said no. And every single one of them said the same thing after that. They couldn't believe it. Not Debbie. Not here. Not on this street. The Marietta police responded quickly. Officers documented the handprints on the Volkswagen, cataloged the spilled detergent, and took formal statements from both witnesses. The 12-year-old's description of the driver, combined with what the second adult witness had seen, allowed investigators to build a composite sketch. White male, medium build, driving a dark 1950s model pickup truck. It wasn't much, but it was something. What happened next is one of the most remarkable community responses in the history of Georgia cold cases, and it almost never gets the credit it deserves. They called it Operation Debbie. More than 4,000 volunteers answered. For 1,000 ordinary people who had never sat at the Randall family's dinner table, who simply could not stay home, knowing a 9-year-old was out there somewhere in January. The Concerned Citizens Committee organized search grids across Cobb County. Amateur radio operators set up communication networks that stretched across the region. Civil defense workers coordinated teams through the surrounding neighborhoods and the heavy tree lines beyond the subdivisions. And Melvin Randall, 10 years old, still recovering from a fever he had no time for, moved through all of it with a stack of flyers that had his sister's face on them, talking to strangers, walking streets he had already walked, refusing to stop because stopping meant accepting something he was not prepared to accept. Back in the apartment, Debbie's baseball bat leaned against the wall where she had left it. Nobody moved it. Nobody said a word about it. It just stood there waiting. 5 days passed, then 10, then 2 full weeks, and the silence that followed was the kind that presses against the walls of a house and makes everything inside it feel smaller. No credible sightings, no confirmed leads, no trace of the dark pickup truck or the man who had been watching from inside it. And this is the part that deserves far more than a sentence on a timeline, because those 16 days were not simply a gap in the investigation. They were 16 days of a family in suspension, caught between a hope they were terrified to hold and the truth they were more terrified to face. Juanita woke up every single morning not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. She woke up and made the choice to keep going anyway, because there was no other option a mother could make. John moved through each day with the mechanical precision of a man who has learned to function while a part of him has gone missing. And Melvin carried the specific, suffocating weight that belongs only to the person who was supposed to be there. The person who stayed home. The person whose fever had felt in the preceding weeks like nothing more than an inconvenience, and had now become the fact around which the rest of his life would organize itself. January 29th, 1972. 16 days after Debbie disappeared. The sky was the color of pewter, and the rain had been falling since morning, the kind of steady, soaking rain that makes every step heavier and every sound duller, and the world feel like it is pressing down from above. A group of Southern Tech students were still searching. They had been out for hours. One of them was a young man named Mike Mahan, a Vietnam veteran who had come home from the war and enrolled in school, trying to build something that resembled a normal life. He had walked through things in Vietnam that most people are fortunate enough never to encounter. He thought he had seen the worst the world had to offer. He was not prepared for what he found in those trees off Perry Road. After several hours of moving through heavy brush and wet ground near the Fox Hill subdivision, Mike Mahan stopped walking. There were drag marks in the mud in front of him. Long, deliberate, unmistakable lines cut into the wet earth, heading deeper into the tree line. He followed them. Roughly 1,000 feet south of the intersection of Windy Hill and Perry Road, in the mud and the rain and the terrible silence of the Georgia woods in January, Mike Mahan found Debbie Lynn Randall. She was fully clothed. Only her socks remained on her feet. The lavender shoes, the Christmas shoes she had been so proud of, the shoes her family would have recognized from 100 yards away, were gone. Someone had removed them. Someone had taken them home. That detail is not incidental. That detail is a window into the mind of the person who did this, and what it reveals is patient, deliberate, and chilling. Dr. Larry Howard of the Georgia State Crime Lab conducted the examination and confirmed what investigators had feared from the first night. Debbie had been assaulted. Her cause of death was strangulation. Evidence at the scene suggested her killer had used her own coat to silence her during the attack, a detail that speaks to both the violence and the coldness of what happened in those woods. But it was the geologist's report that truly changed the direction of the investigation. Soil samples taken from Debbie's clothing were analyzed, and what came back was not what investigators expected. The dirt on her body came from 2 distinct locations. One soil composition matched the dump site where she was found. The other matched a very specific clay profile the kind produced by the Dixie Cast and Stone Company on Powers Ferry Road, approximately 3 miles away. Debbie was not killed in those woods. She was killed somewhere else. Transported. Placed. Her killer had time to plan. He had access to a vehicle. He knew this geography well enough to choose 2 separate locations for 2 separate purposes. This was not a man acting on pure panic. This was a man covering his tracks. And for 51 years, he succeeded. 2 pieces of physical evidence were recovered near the body. The first was a single strand of brown hair. Lab analysis in 1972 concluded it came from a white male, likely between 18 and 30 years of age. The second was a small circular piece of cloth bearing a floral pattern, the kind of scrap that could come from a jacket lining, a work shirt, a piece of upholstery. Both were logged into evidence. Both were photographed, sealed, and stored. And with the technology available in 1972, both were completely useless. There was no database to check, no molecular test to run, no way to look at a strand of hair and find the name of the man it came from. The investigators knew what they had. They just had no way to use it yet. So they did the only thing they could do. They preserved it anyway. They sealed it into a box and labeled it carefully, not knowing they were packaging a message for a future they couldn't quite imagine. Thousands packed Roswell Street Baptist Church for Debbie's funeral. The building couldn't hold them all. The overflow spilled out onto the street, people standing in the rain to be there because being there was the only thing left to do. Debbie was laid to rest at Kentstone Memorial Park, and the man who put her there went home, closed his door, went on with his life, certain it was over, certain he had gotten away with it. He was almost right. He made one mistake. He left something behind, and it was waiting for him. Now, pause for just a second. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story. Because what is about to unfold in this investigation is one of the most extraordinary cold case breakthroughs in the history of American forensic science, and Debbie Lynn Randall deserves every single person who sees it. The 4 detectives who worked this case in 1972 were Lieutenant Bill Hudson, Major Tim Buckley, Captain Bill Elliott, and Lieutenant Ray Owens. They were not careless men. They were not indifferent men. They followed every lead that came in, and hundreds came in from across Marietta and Cobb County, from people who thought they had seen something, people who had heard something, people who simply needed to feel like they were doing something. Each tip was logged. Each one was tracked down. Each one was checked. And each one eventually went nowhere. The composite sketch circulated widely and led to no confirmed identification. The dark pickup truck was never definitively traced. The witnesses had given everything their memories could hold, and it still wasn't enough to put a name to the man in that rearview mirror. But here's the thing that separates the detectives who worked this case from so many others who might have walked away. Before they closed the file, before they moved on to the next case, the next family, the next set of questions with no answers, they made a choice. They packed every piece of physical evidence they had recovered, the hair, the cloth, every last fragment, into a box, and they stored it properly. They did this in a world that had no practical use for what they were preserving. They did it anyway. They couldn't have known what would eventually be possible. They couldn't have known that what they were sealing into that box would one day be capable of speaking louder than any witness, any confession, any testimony. They just knew it was all they had. So they kept it. Years passed. Then a decade. Then 2. The Randall family lived inside the silence the way families do when there is no resolution, carrying the unanswered question like a stone in the center of the chest that never fully dissolves, never quite lets you breathe the way you used to. Juanita kept every newspaper article ever printed about Debbie's case. Every one. She built a paper record of a search that the world had eventually stopped joining, because that was all she could do. John carried something in his eyes that people who knew him before January of 1972 said was simply not there before. And Melvin grew up. He finished school. He built a life, the way you build a life when you have no choice but to keep going. He watched his own hair go gray. He became a man that his sister never got to know. And he woke up some mornings with the weight of the same question he had carried since he was 10 years old, pressing against the inside of his chest like a fist. Who took her? Where is the person who did this? Are they still out there? Do they still remember her? Does her name mean anything to them at all? In 2001, a detective named Morris Nix went looking through cold case files and found Debbie's. Nix was not approaching this case from a professional distance. He was a lifelong Marietta resident. He had been a young boy when Debbie disappeared, old enough in January of 1972 to understand that something terrible had happened, old enough to remember his mother telling him to stay inside, to come straight home, not to talk to strangers, the specific maternal fear that settles over a neighborhood after a child goes missing and never fully lifts, old enough to remember the way the air itself felt different after, the way the street was quieter, the way adults spoke in lower voices, the way the innocence of that particular corner of that particular Georgia town never quite came back. When Morris Nix opened that evidence box in 2001, what he felt was not the detached curiosity of a detective reviewing an old file. It was something older and more personal than that. He sent the preserved strand of brown hair to the FBI for testing. Modern forensic techniques extracted a partial DNA profile. White male, consistent in every respect with the original laboratory findings from 1972. Investigators ran the profile against every available database. They looked everywhere a match could exist. They found nothing. The man who had killed Debbie Lynn Randall had never been arrested for anything that required his DNA to be collected and stored. He had lived a life that left no biological record in any system. The profile existed. It pointed at a man who was out there somewhere. It could go no further. The technology had improved. It just hadn't improved enough. Nix placed the evidence carefully back in a box, closed the lid, and waited. In March of 2015, Cobb County established something new, a dedicated cold case unit, staffed with investigators whose entire purpose was to return to exactly these kinds of files with fresh eyes and updated science. In its first 2 years of operation, the unit resolved 9 cases, secured 8 arrests, and pursued 6 criminal prosecutions. 9 families who had been living the way the Randalls lived, in suspension, in silence, in a grief that never properly closes, received answers they had stopped fully believing would ever come. Morris Nix came back to the unit. He brought Debbie's file with him, and this time, the focus shifted from the hair to the cloth. The small circular piece of fabric with the floral design, recovered near Debbie's body in 1972, had spent more than 40 years in that evidence box, holding something, waiting for someone to ask it the right question. The cloth was submitted to a forensic laboratory for updated DNA analysis using techniques that simply had not existed when it was first collected. A partial male DNA profile was extracted. Investigators ran the profile through CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System, containing biological records collected from convicted offenders across the entire country. If the man whose DNA was on that cloth had ever been formally processed by the criminal justice system anywhere in the United States, the database would find the connection. The search returned nothing. He was not in the system. He had never put himself there. After 43 years, after a dedicated cold case unit, an updated forensic science, and the full resources of the National DNA Database, Debbie's killer remained a ghost. The cloth went back into storage, and the family went on waiting. October of 2021, the Cobb County District Attorney's Office received a federal grant from the Bureau of Justice, funding allocated specifically for the pursuit of unsolved cold cases. And that money unlocked a capability that had not existed as a practical investigative tool even 5 years earlier. Genetic genealogy. The concept is this. Rather than searching for the killer directly, you search for the people who share his blood. Somewhere out there, at least one person who carries the same DNA markers as the man who killed Debbie Lynn Randall had voluntarily uploaded their genetic profile to a public ancestry database. They did it to find cousins. They did it to fill in their family tree. They did it out of curiosity about where their people came from. They did it with absolutely no awareness that a piece of fabric recovered from a 1972 crime scene in Marietta, Georgia, was about to reach across 50 years and find them. In 2022, the circular cloth was submitted to DNA Labs International, a forensic laboratory based in Florida. Their task was precise: extract a SNP profile from the DNA on that cloth, a single nucleotide polymorphism profile, a genetic fingerprint detailed enough to be compared against the millions of voluntary submissions sitting in public ancestry databases, and find any thread, however distant, that connected back to the contributor. The cloth had waited 50 years in the dark. It had survived the wrong decade, the wrong technology, the wrong moment in science. It had waited patiently, the way evidence waits for the world to be ready to understand it. In 2023, the world was ready, and the cloth finally spoke. What followed was not a revelation that arrived in a single moment. It was weeks of methodical, painstaking reconstruction. The initial return from the genetic database was not a name. It was a connection, a partial genetic overlap between the DNA on the cloth and an individual who had voluntarily submitted their profile in search of their family history. That individual was not the killer. They were a relative, possibly a distant one, someone who had gone about their ordinary life with no knowledge that one of their blood relatives had, 50 years earlier, committed an act of terrible violence against a 9-year-old girl. From that single thread of connection, investigators began building a family tree by hand, branch by branch, generation by generation. They cross-referenced public records, census data, birth certificates, death records, marriage licenses, anything that could help them map the landscape of family and work inward toward the one individual who matched every parameter the evidence described. White male, between 18 and 30 years old in January of 1972, connected in some verifiable way to the neighborhood where Debbie Randall lived. The tree grew. The circle tightened. The list of possible individuals narrowed. And then, out of that narrowing, a name emerged with a clarity that stopped investigators in place. William B. Rose, Mableton, Georgia, 24 years old on January 13, 1972. Investigators pulled every record they could find on William B. Rose. His background, his history, his criminal record, his known associates, his family connections. And the very first detail that brought the work in that room to a temporary standstill was this: William B. Rose had never, at any point, been a suspect in this case. Not in 1972, when the investigation was active and leads were still coming in daily. Not in 2001, when Morris Nix sent the hair to the FBI. Not in 2015, when the cold case unit formally reopened the file. Not once, in 51 years of investigation, had his name appeared in connection with Debbie Randall. He had lived inside the investigation's blind spot for 5 decades, completely invisible. His criminal record was almost comically thin given what investigators were now beginning to suspect about him. A handful of alcohol-related arrests, no violence on file, no history of anything that would have raised a flag in any standard search. To the people who knew William Rose, to his neighbors, his family members, the people he passed in the street, he was simply a young man from Mableton with a drinking problem. Nothing more remarkable than that. But then came the connection that made everything suddenly terribly clear. Rose had family members who lived in the same apartment complex as the Randall family. He had been to that complex before, possibly many times. He knew the layout. He knew the rhythms of the place. When children played outside, which families came and when at which hours, what the parking lot looked like in the early evening. Investigator Ron Alter, who led the modern phase of the investigation, would later note that children in that complex played outside routinely. Rose had almost certainly seen Debbie before, probably more than once. She was not a stranger to him. He was a stranger to her. And on the evening of January 13th, when a 9-year-old girl in lavender shoes pushed open the glass door of a laundromat and stepped out alone into the night, he saw not a child, not a person, not a life. He saw an opportunity. This is the thing that stays with you after you study a case like this. Debbie Lynn Randall was not specifically chosen. She was not hunted. She was not targeted because of anything about who she was. She was chosen because of when she was there, because of a 40-minute window, because of a coin pressed into her small hand and a sick brother who stayed in bed, because of the precise collision of her ordinary evening and his extraordinary evil. A matter of minutes, a matter of a door swinging open at the wrong moment. That is all it took, and that is the most unsettling truth this case has to offer. There was one significant problem standing between investigators and a formal resolution. William B. Rose was dead. He had died by suicide in 1974. Just 2 years after the night, he drove a Dar pickup truck away from a Marietta parking lot with a 9-year-old girl inside it. He was 26 years old. 2 years of living with what he had done. 2 years of waking up every morning as the man who had taken Debbie Randall's life and kept her lavender shoes. According to the conversations investigator Ron Alter had with Rose's surviving family members, the months before his death had been marked by a visible, escalating fear that his family could not fully explain at the time. He was afraid of going to jail. He was anxious in a way that seemed to exceed what his minor alcohol-related troubles warranted. His family assumed his fear was connected to those incidents. They had no idea what he was actually carrying. Alter's professional assessment was measured and direct. Rose almost certainly believed, in the weeks before he died, that investigators were closing in on him. Whether that belief was based on actual knowledge of the investigation's progress, or simply the paranoia of a guilty man who had too much time to think about what he'd done, there is no way to say with certainty. What can be said with certainty is that William B. Rose chose to end his life rather than face what he had done. He chose to leave his family without explanation. He chose, in the most cowardly possible way, to try to take his secret with him. He almost succeeded. He came closer than he knew. But he made one mistake on one January evening, and that mistake had spent 50 years waiting in a box in an evidence room, waiting for exactly this moment. Before a single public statement could be made, before the Randall family could be told anything definitive, investigators needed something absolute. The genetic genealogy work was compelling. The circumstantial connections were strong. But compelling and strong are not the same as confirmed. And this family that had already waited 51 years, was not going to be given anything less than certainty. With the full cooperation and consent of William B., Rose's surviving family members, who had no prior knowledge of his involvement in Debbie's death, and who, by all accounts, were devastated by what they were learning about the man they had known, a formal exhumation was conducted. Direct DNA samples were extracted from Rose's remains. Those samples were submitted to the forensic laboratory and compared, point by point, against the profile that had been painstakingly recovered from the circular piece of cloth. The match was exact, not probable, not consistent, not suggestive. Exact. William B. Rose was Debbie Lynn Randall's killer. After 51 years, after a sealed evidence box, and a Vietnam veteran walking through the rain, and a detective who grew up on the same streets, and 4,000 volunteers, and a piece of cloth smaller than a fist, the answer was no longer a ghost. It had a name. September 18th, 2023. Cobb County, Georgia. District Attorney Flynn D. Brody Jr. stood before cameras and reporters and the public record of this case, and chose his words carefully, the way you choose words when they have been 51 years in the making. He acknowledged the weight of what the family had carried. He acknowledged the loss that no answer could undo. He acknowledged that truth, however long delayed, still matters. Then Morris Nix stood up, the lifelong Marietta resident, the boy who had once been told to stay inside because a little girl from his neighborhood was missing, the detective who had opened a box in 2001 and felt something old and personal stir in his chest, the man who had put that evidence back into storage and told himself to wait for the world to catch up, and then waited and kept working and never stopped believing that the cloth and the hair had something to say if only the science would one day be ready to hear it. He stood at that podium in 2023 and said what needed to be said, not just on behalf of Cobb County, on behalf of every person who had knocked on a door in January of 1972 with a flashlight and a flyer, on behalf of every radio operator who had sat up through the night, on behalf of Mike Mahan, who found her in the rain and carried what he saw for the rest of his life, on behalf of Juanita, who kept every newspaper article, on behalf of John, who carried something behind his eyes that never fully left, and on behalf of Melvin Randall, who was 10 years old and sick with a fever on the night his sister walked out the front door, who spent 51 years waking up with the same question, who went door to door through the dark with a stack of flyers, because what else do you do when the person you love is gone and the night is right there in front of you, and every door is still a possibility? Melvin finally had his answer. Not the answer anyone would have chosen. Not the answer that brings her back, or erases the 51 years, or makes the weight of it any lighter to carry. But the truth. The real, confirmed, documented truth. William B. Rose, 24 years old, Mableton, Georgia. He took her. He moved her. He kept her shoes. And he went home and tried to disappear back into an ordinary life. He almost made it. But Debbie Lynn Randall was not ordinary. She was the loudest laugh in any room. She was the queen of a neighborhood baseball team. She was her brother's best friend and her mother's joy and a child whose name 4,000 people came out into the cold to shout into the dark because they simply could not bear to let her go quietly. The lavender shoes are gone, but Debbie's name is not. It never should have been forgotten. It will not be forgotten here. Here is what I want you to hold on to before you close this video. In 1972, 4 detectives could have let that evidence deteriorate. They could have cleared the shelf space. They could have decided that what they had was not worth preserving. They didn't. In 2001, Morris Nix could have looked at a partial DNA profile with no matching record and closed the file for good. He didn't. In 2015, a cold case unit could have passed over a case that was already 43 years cold in favor of something more recent. They didn't. The truth about Debbie Randall took 51 years to arrive. It arrived because people refused to stop believing it was possible, because evidence was treated as sacred, because technology eventually caught up to the patience of the people who had been waiting for it, and because a 9-year-old girl in lavender shoes deserved the same thing every victim deserves: to be seen, to be remembered, and to have the person who took her life be known by name. William B. Rose is now known by name. Debbie Lynn Randall is now known by the truth of what happened to her. And somewhere, in some quiet part of the grief this family will carry forever, there is now something solid where there used to be only silence. If this story moved you, if you believe that cases like Debbie's deserve to be told, and that the people who were taken deserve to be remembered, please like this video right now, subscribe to Stories Solve the Missing J, and share this with one person who needs to hear it. Every view is a statement that the forgotten deserve to be found. Every subscriber tells the algorithm that these stories matter. I'll be back with the next case soon. Until then, remember her name, Deborah Lynn Randall. Debbie, and she was 9 years old.